Protests have erupted for a seventh day across the United States, which were initially sparked by the death of George Floyd. His family has called for protesters to abstain from violence. Let's take a look at the latest developments. Donald Trump says attacks on police by protesters are acts of domestic terrorism. The president briefly left the grounds of the White House to stand outside a boarded-up church in Washington, D.C. An independent autopsy commissioned by George Floyd's family has found he died by asphyxiation. The medical examiner's report now says the death was a homicide. The police officer charged over Mr Floyd's death has had his first court appearance postponed until next week. There have now been protests in at least 75 cities across America. 40 cities have imposed curfews. 17,000 members of the National Guard are supporting local authorities in 23 states, as well as in the capital, Washington. And more than 4,000 people have been arrested across the country over the past week. Let's take a look at some of the latest pictures coming out of the United States. This is Washington, D.C. We can see once again protesters on the streets in defiance of that curfew, which is in place not just in Washington, but of course across many cities of the United States this evening. And as mentioned, the President, Donald Trump, has warned, or threatened at least, to send in the US military to those states which do not control their protests by deploying the National Guard. In a conference called to state governors, he described many of them as weak for not controlling the protests. So early evening here on the east coast of the United States at the moment. Let's cross now direct to Washington to our correspondent, North America Bureau Chief David Lipson. David, just describe the situation on the streets there at the moment.
Well, it's a pretty bizarre scene on the streets of Washington, D.C. right now. You have these cordons set up all over the city, and then you have a mob or several mobs roaming around from place to place, being chased out from place to place. So trying to find out where they are and where they will next be is quite a difficult task. Right now, as you can see, all is quiet, but it doesn't take long and much for the streets to be filled with people who are chanting for justice for African Americans and other issues of inequality and injustice as well. We have seen hundreds, perhaps thousands of people on the streets defying the curfew, but we've also seen a ring of strength and steel, if you like, in the form of not just police, but also the National Guard, as you mentioned, and all sorts of other agencies as well that have donned riot gear to try to maintain the peace in this city. For example, you may be able to see the officers behind me. They're from the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency of the United States, and they have been called in to man this particular corner of the United States. So a very uncertain time, a rowdy time. At this point, we haven't seen widespread destruction, arson and looting as we saw last night, but the night is still young, and I'm only talking about this one city. This is the scene that's playing out in many cities right across the United States. The President, Donald Trump, is taking, again, a no-tolerance approach to this. As you mentioned, he's urging the governors to clamp down and clamp down hard by using the National Guard against these protesters. And he's saying if that doesn't work, he's willing to call in the military proper to take over.
Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
David, there was quite a strange turn of events earlier in the day there, your time, that President Trump, he was initially taking refuge in the White House, then he was seen out on the streets.
Yeah, it's been an unusual couple of days for the President. He was not seen or heard for the better part of 2 days. We hear that he did take refuge in the bunker in the White House last night when those protests got pretty ugly and there were fires burning pretty much just outside his front door. But tonight, a different approach, that statement that you heard a part of just then from the Rose Garden. Then we saw the riot police push the crowd back. No one knew why. It turns out the President wanted to stroll out the front gates of the White House and visit the church that was set alight last night, a historic church that was built in 1812 and has been visited by every president since then, including Donald Trump. He wanted to appear before the cameras and give a message of support and perhaps portray an image of strength and control to the rest of America and the world at a time when, 50 metres away, behind the cordon of riot police, there was still major scenes of disorder going on.
Yes, so David, how has that been perceived, that walk that he did, but also, as we mentioned, those threats, not only to protests, but essentially to state governors as well? What's the reaction been to those?
Well, starting with the governors, they're not all happy about it. There was a pretty swift response from several of the governors saying that they are, in fact, doing everything they can. They obviously took issue that the President was essentially calling them weak for not gaining control of their cities, and they also pointed the finger back at the White House for some of the inflammatory language, as they saw it, that has been coming particularly out of the President's Twitter feed. As for the protesters, well, I don't think they had much of an idea that the President was even there or had even spoken. Their anger has been very much vented at the police and the other agencies that are on the streets of Washington, D.C. This evening. And in some cases, the businesses and shops and shop fronts and windows and whatever else they can destroy, many of which are actually boarded up this evening in an effort to protect them from further destruction.
David, thanks very much. That is David Lipson, our Washington Bureau Chief.